Hello. Today I'm going to talk about the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. And I'm going to get into some of the symbolism and kind of a brief overview of the whole series. Probably without... There'll be some mild spoilers, but I'm going to try to keep it where if you haven't read it, it will be fresh for you. If you like what you see here, you can hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell, any of that kind of stuff. First thing I'm going to say about this is one of my favorite book series of all time, I'd say. It's had a huge influence on my own writing. My own spiritual journey has been greatly influenced by this work as well. So we're going to start with a quick synopsis. The Dark Tower series follows Roland Deschain, the last gunslinger, on his quest to reach the enigmatic Dark Tower, a nexus of realities that holds the fate of existence itself. As Roland journeys through a desolate and perilous world, he gathers a quartet of companions whose loyalty is tested by both external threats and inner demons. Along the way, Roland confronts powerful enemies, uncovers ancient mysteries, and grapples with questions of destiny, sacrifice, and the nature of reality in his relentless pursuit of the tower. Basically what this is it's one part Lord of the Rings and one part Good and the Bad and the Ugly. So if you can imagine a world where it is the technology level of the Old West, but there's also this kind of element of magic going on, and the supernatural and the occult. So in that way, it's a little bit more like Lord of the Rings. It's this post-apocalyptic quest story that I think really resonates in a profound way, at least to me. There are 7 books in the main cycle, along with some other tangential stuff that I'll talk about after. The first thing I should say is I was gifted this book, the second book, when I was a teenager by my mother. I didn't actually start with the first book, which is a little bit unorthodox, but my mother bought me the book because I had read Pet Sematary and Salem's Lot, and she saw it in the grocery store, and she's like, oh, Stephen King, like, he'll probably like this. So she brought the book home and gave it to me, not realizing it was not the first book, it was the second book. So when I started reading it, I was like, what is going on here? And then I gradually realized it wasn't the beginning of the story. What I end up having to do is get a hold of the first book and then kind of catch my way up. So book 1 is The Gunslinger, and it was originally published in 1982, but there's also a revised edition from 2003. Roland Deschain, the last gunslinger, pursues the enigmatic man in black across a desolate wasteland, driven by his quest for the mysterious Dark Tower and haunted by memories of his troubled past. The story begins with this opening line: the man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. The gunslinger is Roland Deschain. He is basically a kind of Clint Eastwood figure. If you were to combine Clint Eastwood with an Arthurian knight, maybe that's kind of what he is. And he's chasing this man that he calls the man in black, but this guy goes by many names: Walter Paddock, Walter O'Dim, Randall Flagg, and various other aliases. And he's kind of like this, I don't want to call him Satan, because there's a character in this, the Crimson King, which is basically like Satan. He's more of like the minion of Satan, sort of the minion of chaos, I guess. He's kind of a wizard, kind of a black magician. He is Roland's main antagonist, I guess, from a lot of the story. They are in this kind of wasteland, and in the book they kind of refer to it as the world has moved on, which is basically there was some kind of apocalypse, and now everything is kind of destroyed or decaying. That is kind of the main crux of the story, is this decay that's happening. There is the Dark Tower, which is at the center of existence, and Roland's quest is to get to the Dark Tower, and he needs to chase the man in black to find out where the Dark Tower is. Roland is a haunted figure. He carries lots of regrets, and now that I'm in middle age, I kind of even connect more with him than I did, I think, when I read it originally. because I have read this a few times. He's the entry point into the story, so he kind of sets the tone. It introduces his Captain Ahab style quest, and he definitely does a lot of ruthless things to try to complete this quest. This book basically sets up the main players, and it mostly centers on Roland, but there are some flashbacks to when he was being trained by his teacher named Court, and there are a few other characters that get introduced, but I'm not going to comment on those because they're kind of spoilers. So yeah, the first book is just a little bit smaller than the rest and a pretty simple story, I'd say, but it has a lot of potential of what's to come, and it definitely hooks you from that opening line on to the rest. Book 2 is The Drawing of the Three from 1987. Roland encounters 3 new companions from different worlds and times as he battles through a series of challenges, driven by his determination to reach the Dark Tower and confront the looming darkness threatening to consume Midworld. Like I said, this was the first book that I had, and I read most of it before going back and reading the first one. Partly because it was just so riveting. It's sort of like a really good, and I'll just be honest, I think it's my favorite of all the books. It introduces his quartet, which is kind of like a group chosen by destiny to help him on his quest. And most of the book is set in New York City and also on this beach in Midworld. Midworld is the name of part of Roland's world. Kind of at his lowest in this book, at least at the beginning, and it's a riveting thing because you're kind of seeing this very hardened warrior struggling, and he meets people that help him on his quest to get through this. One of them is Eddie Dean, and this is a guy he meets in New York City. I should say, actually, the 3 main members of his quartet are all from New York City, but from different times. So there's Eddie Dean, Jake Chambers, which is a boy, and Susanna, but she also goes by Odetta Holmes and Detta Walker. I guess it's a minor spoiler, but she has several kind of aliases. And through this story, he kind of picks them up. That's what King means by the drawing of the 3. Each of their drawings, let's say, are quite fascinating, and they really propel the story forward, and I just think it's gripping when you're in it, when you're reading it. And near the end, they're joined by Oi, which is a billy bumbler, which is a kind of animal, sort of a pet, and he kind of rounds out their quartet. Book 3, we have The Wastelands from 1991. Roland's quartet faces new dangers and trials as they journey deeper into Midworld, guided by visions of the Dark Tower and plagued by the malevolent forces of the Crimson King. So I read this in my last year of high school. I bought it as soon as it came out because I really liked the other 2. And it is a deepening of the quartet. Like in the previous book, it's them meeting. In this one, they're kind of becoming a unit. The Crimson King plays a little bit of a larger role in this. And, I think if I was to compare the Crimson King to anything, I would say he's kind of like Sauron from Lord of the Rings. This kind of anonymous threat far away, kind of. But he has many minions, and the quartet has to fight these minions throughout the whole series. But the main takeaway from this book is the establishment of what they call the beams. The Dark Tower is kind of like at the center of this wheel, and you could call it like the Zodiac or something, but these beams are what holds existence together. And the Crimson King is trying to destroy these beams, and that is established a lot in this story. You get a lot of lore about what the names of the beams and the sort of mythological significance of these things. The main kind of threat in this book is Blaine the Mono, which is a crazy AI monorail system that they need to get on, and it's pretty crazy. This train is actually, even though this was written so long ago, I think it really is, with what's happening today with AI, it's right, it's spot on. If you know anything about the Sphinx or the Jabberwocky from Through the Looking Glass, Blaine is kind of that kind of figure, Riddler, kind of gatekeeper, let's say. But I think what really makes this interesting is, and this is something that comes up a lot in the books, is the dangers of unchecked technology. Now, on one hand, Roland's guns are a form of technology, but they're kind of like an ancient technology in this world. So they're kind of revered a little bit. But there's all this other technology that's kind of gone mad or been destroyed and is still kind of working, that is all very scary, I think. It's kind of like a technological hell in a way. And book 4 is called Wizard and Glass, and it's from 1997. Roland recounts the tragic tale of his youth and first love as his quartet becomes ensnared in a deadly game of treachery and deceit, forcing them to confront their inner demons and the sinister machinations of their enemies. So this is the funny thing about this book for me, is that after finishing The Wasteland, which ends on a massive cliffhanger, I had to wait 6 years to find out what happened. And that was, at that age, that was very, very difficult for me, because I was just out of high school, and, you know, time is a little different when you're that age, and it seemed like it was forever. You know anything about The Empire Strikes Back from Star Wars? That was a similar thing, but when that came out I was a kid, so it was even worse, because I was a kid and 3 years seemed like an eternity. But this was also kind of like that, where I just really wanted to know what happened. Eventually it came out and I found out what happened. It's very interesting. But what's great about this book in particular, compared to the others, is this is a story within a story. There's the main story continuing, but then Roland finally tells his quartet his past. That is an epic tale in itself, and you get to understand why Roland is the man that he is. And I appreciate that it's all kind of done in one gesture, let's say. A lot of times in novels they will pepper in a lot of backstory along the way, and I think that works to a degree. But in this case, because it's its own story, you get really wrapped up in what's going on with it. And I do think he does pepper some of Roland's backstory in the other books, but it's just little things, kind of like his training and mention of his past quartet, because Eddie and Susanna and Jake and Oy are not his first one. He's had a quartet in the past. So you find out more about these characters, which are also very interesting characters. It focuses more on them, two of them in particular, Cuthbert Allgood and Elaine Johns, or Elaine, I'm not sure how you say that, which were both gunslingers. In the main story thread, Roland is kind of teaching the other characters to be gunslingers, but in this story, these other two gunslingers are kind of his equals. It's more of a balanced dynamic between them, where in the main story thread, Roland is definitely the leader. But this mainly involves Roland's first love, Susan Delgado, and this kind of conspiracy that's happening in the barony of Megis, which is part of Gilead, the world that, the kind of province in the world that Roland is from. There's a lot of interesting things in this book, especially with the magic part, because the title is called Wizard and Glass, and there's this kind of witch in the book. And I kind of think, aside from the second book, Drawing of the Three, I think this might be my favorite. It really is kind of heartbreaking. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give too much of it away, but it really is a tragic story. And once he finishes with his story, telling them, it makes you want to know even more about what's going to happen in the main story, because then you kind of see how he has become this Ahab type character. It's very fascinating. And it's why he is the way that he is. Book 5 is called Wolves of the Kala, and that's from 2003. Roland and his quartet aid a besieged town threatened by a horde of deadly wolves, uncovering dark secrets and facing moral dilemmas that challenge their resolve and unity. And here was another 6-year gap that I had to wait. Thankfully, the other book didn't really end on much of a cliffhanger, so it wasn't as hard, but it still was very hard. But the final 3 books in the series came out very quickly. And I think there's good and bad about that, which I'll get to in a minute when I'm discussing the other books. But in this one, the residents of Calla Bryn Sturgis are being terrorized by this group called the Wolves, which is this kind of mysterious, I don't want to say cult, but group that has been stealing their children. And, you know, I think this is heavily influenced by the Seven Samurai, the Magnificent Seven. But what's great about this one is that it really solidifies them as heroes and as gunslingers. So they're finally like kind of transcending their student time and becoming actual gunslingers. So it's interesting to see them work as a unit. And some of the main things that are discussed in this are things like free will versus destiny. And, you know, are you stuck in this path, or do you have choices that you can actually make? It starts to get into kind of metafiction. There's other connections included in this that are connected to Stephen King's other works, which he didn't do as much in the first books. I mean, there was some connection, like the character Randall Flagg, if you know the book The Stand, he's an important character in that, and Randall Flagg is also the Man in Black, so there was that connection. But in this one, he brings in Father Callahan from Salem's Lot, and you're like, oh, interesting, which I actually really appreciated because I like Salem's Lot quite a lot, and the Father Callahan character is quite complex, so it's interesting to see him kind of have a longer life past that other book. And I guess it's a minor spoiler, but I think it even says it on the synopsis, so I don't think it is that big of a deal. What is great about it is this kind of fate versus redemption thing, and you know, the father and Roland have a lot in common, I'd say. They're both kind of broken men. They kind of immediately have this bond, I guess, is the best way to put it. Compared to the other books, I think there's a bit of a drop in quality here. I'm not saying they're not good, but the like Wizard and Glass and Drawing of the Three are like super good. So this feels a little bit like a step down in quality, but I do think it's still riveting, and it just gets you one step closer to the Dark Tower. Book 6 is called The Song of Susanna, and it's from 2004. Susanna Dean grapples with a mysterious pregnancy and a sinister doppelganger as Roland and his quartet race against time to prevent the destruction of the Dark Tower and preserve the fate of all worlds. So this one focuses more on her. Now when I say that, that doesn't mean all the other characters aren't present and they're all doing things, but this is kind of her story. I don't want to spoil which book is important for which character, but they all kind of have their own book, I think, where they are showcased, and this is definitely hers. And it focuses mostly on identity and duality, which is a major part of her character, I'd say. It gets back into a direct connection to the other worlds, the multiverse. I mentioned in Drawing of the Three that he goes to New York. Well, this is connected to New York as well, quite a lot, and it really incorporates the Arthurian legend here a lot, because there's a character, Mordred Deshane, which you're like, oh, you know, who is this guy? There's the quest for the unfound door, so they're trying to find this door to get to the Dark Tower, but they can't find it. It's being hidden. And then there's the Breakers, which are their, you know, in the old westerns, there's always like these groups of cowboys that kind of, they're almost like mercenaries or whatever. That's kind of what the Breakers are, but they're minions for the Crimson King, and they're kind of the main villains, I'd say. And there's a lot of this stuff that has to do with corporations, which you wouldn't think belongs in this story, but it actually works quite well. And you kind of understand that this conspiracy is very large. But the one thing that this book does a lot of is it breaks the fourth wall. And you're kind of like, what is going on here? Because before this, there were kind of these little sprinkles of hints to this meta world that he creates. But in this one, it kind of gets blown apart. And in the last book, it's completely blown apart. But I don't want to say what it is because it's a spoiler. But the thing that's great about book 6 is the urgency and pace. You can kind of tell this is getting to the point where the finale is coming. So I read this book quite fast. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, like Wolves of the Kala, it's a little bit of a drop in quality. One thing I should mention is that before Wolves of the Kala, Stephen King got in a pretty bad accident where he was hit by a car. And it's actually what got him to finish the series, because he was kind of having writer's block. That experience really makes its way into these books. Now, I almost think maybe he wrote them too fast. Like, he was thinking, I need to get this done if I die or whatever. So he kind of like, I think the last 3 books are a little bit more, I don't want to say they were rushed, but they're not as deep, I think, as the first 4, maybe. Now, I'm not saying they're not good, so, you know, don't get me wrong in that way, but I just think that they're a little bit, especially book 5 and 6, I think maybe could have, if he had taken more time, they might have been better, let's say. Book 7, we have The Dark Tower from 2004. Roland and his companions finally reach the Dark Tower, confronting their deepest fears and the ultimate test of their courage, loyalty, and sacrifice in a climactic battle between light and darkness. So this is the culmination of the whole thing, and it's epic in scope. It's heartbreaking. I think this book and book 4 are the ones that really tug at your heartstrings the most, more than I thought it would be. You know, I think that's one thing that Stephen King is good at, is he gets you to really identify with the characters, and when they go through their ordeals, you really feel it. And in this, it's definitely that way. The story becomes even more meta and kind of postmodern, maybe. And there's some controversy about that. Some people don't like that he did that, but I actually think it works well. And I can see, as a writer, and not just as a writer, but as a writer that understands that writing is a kind of magic, I can see how the story took him there. He didn't make that up. Life and the story came out of that, and it kind of carried him through. So I don't think he had much of a choice, and it is what it is now. So I don't have negative feelings about it, but I know some people do. You know, one of the big themes in these books is sacrifice and redemption, and there's a lot of sacrifice in this book. Many people make tough choices, and you know, because you've spent so much time with these characters, 7 books full for most of them. Well, Roland was in all 7, but the rest of them were in at least 6 of them. It really pays off, you know. You don't get that much time with a character usually. You know, in a novel you have a few hundred pages, but this is 7 novels, so it has a lot of payoff. The ending is a bit ambiguous, but I think it works for what it is. There's this kind of cycle of time, and because of that's the main crux of the story, I think it works. And it's bittersweet when you finish. You're kind of sad because you want it to keep going because it's such a good story. Okay, so there's some tangential material. The first is a book that he published in 2012 called The Wind Through the Keyhole. And this is technically book 4.5. It kind of takes place in between book 4 and book 5. And Roland recounts a previously untold tale from his past, offering insight into his early years as a gunslinger and the formative experiences that shaped his destiny and drove him toward the elusive Dark Tower. So this is another story within a story. And, it's almost a repeat of Wizard and Glass in a way, at least the structure of it, but the story is very different. And it is about his youth, and it has to do with a shapeshifter. It's at a time where his the kingdom of Gilead has not fallen, so he's not a knight errant like he eventually becomes. So there's this kind of looming dread that's in the story. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good story. I can kind of see, if you read the 7 books and you weren't that impressed by them, then I wouldn't dive into this. But if you did like those, it's a gift to get another story with those characters in it. His quartet, Eddie and Susanna and Jake, are not in this book a lot because they're kind of like the bookends of the story, but it is good to have all of them kind of represented. There is also a novella, a prequel novella, called The Little Sisters of Illyria from 1998. Roland Deschain, injured and alone, encounters a mysterious group of healers in the town of Illyria who harbor deadly secrets. As Roland struggles to survive their twisted intentions, he faces a nightmarish battle against dark forces that threaten to consume him and unravel his quest for the Dark Tower. So this actually reminds me a little bit of Drawing of the Three, in the fact that in Drawing of the Three, Roland is at his lowest, and this is also a story, a prequel story, where he is at a very low point. I'm not exactly sure, but I think this takes place shortly before The Gunslinger, the first book. So he's already on the quest, but he's kind of stumbling, let's say. But it shows his determination, which is his grit. I think that's the better term. It's fascinating just to see his resourcefulness and grit in the face of what might seem like certain death, which is also what happens in Drawing of the Three. This book reminds me a bit of Salem's Lot for different reasons, and it's a nice contained story, so I like that about it as well. And it's a novella, so it's short, but it gets to the point, and I think it works well. There are more short stories and relevant work, but I'm not going to get into those. I'm just going to mention them real quick. There's a story, The Man in Black, Low Men in Yellow Coats, Hearts in Atlantis, The Stand is tangentially connected to this, Insomnia, The Talisman, and Black House. If you want to look into those, if you like the story, you might get a little bit more out of it. But next, I'm going to get into the symbolism of this cycle. The first thing is the Rosicrucianism. Rosicrucianism is a philosophical an esoteric tradition that emerged in Europe during the early 17th century, often associated with mysticism, alchemy, and spiritual enlightenment. While King's use of Rosicrucian symbolism isn't explicit, some readers and scholars have identified elements in the series that resonate with Rosicrucian themes. I actually think there's a lot of Rosicrucian themes in here and symbolism. The first would be the quest, the kind of knight-errant quest. It's a journey toward a kind of enlightenment and understanding of the universe's mysteries. There is a lot of alchemy and transformation in the story. If I'm thinking of Wizard and Glass especially, the character, the kind of wizard in it, she's more like a witch, I guess. She makes me think of alchemy a lot. And, all the characters are going through these transformations, and not just one time, but these kind of cycles of transformation, which I think is very alchemical. The symbolism of the tower is very prevalent in alchemical thought. It's kind of like the philosopher's stone or sorcerer's stone. Destiny, his quartet is a kind of destiny, which I also think is part of the Rosicrucian philosophy. We have the symbol of the rose, which is the emblem of the Rosicrucians, because the Rosicrucian means rosy cross, and the rose is a huge symbol in the story. I mean, there's this kind of rose in a vacant lot in New York that is like the symbol of hope and redemption it's first introduced in the drawing of the three, but it's a reminder kind of what they're fighting to save, and it represents goodness and purity, and it's a very important symbol in Rosicrucian thought. So I don't think that was an accident by King. The cross is sacrifice and suffering and the quest for redemption, which is what this whole series is about. Roland, of all the characters, has the largest burden, and he has to carry his cross through the story. And, you know, people don't always think about knighthood as being Rosicrucian, but the Rosicrucians were actually involved as knights. And the gunslinger is basically a knight. They follow the mythological figure of Arthur Eld in this story, and it's basically King Arthur. So there's this idea of chivalry and honor and the quest for righteousness. Arthur Eld is described as the legendary king who united the disparate lands of Midworld and brought about a golden age of peace and prosperity. He is revered as a noble and just ruler, a beacon of hope in a world plagued by strife and conflict. Arthur Eld's legacy looms large throughout Midworld, inspiring generations of knights and warriors to uphold the ideals of honor and courage. And that brings me to the knighthood and the gunslingers. They are kind of the modern day counterpart of the elite knights. They follow a strict code of conduct called the Way of the Eld, and it's basically chivalry. And obviously the quest for the Dark Tower is kind of like a holy grail quest. Even the symbolism of Excalibur is brought to bear here. The guns of the gunslinger are kind of treated as almost totemistic or an emblem. I don't want to say what happens to Roland where he has to give up one of his guns, but it's like this, it's like losing part of himself. You know, it is a potent symbol of knighthood. The original story was based off of Child Roland to the Dark Tower Came, a Robert Browning poem. I don't know if you know, but the word child, spelled with an E, actually refers to a wandering knight. There are many examples of this in literature. Another example is Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by Lord Byron. It's another story of the travels and reflections of a world-weary knight, basically. This knight-errant symbol is in many stories. The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser. This epic poem features the character of the Red Cross Knight, who embarks on a quest to rescue Una and fight against the forces of evil. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This medieval romance tells the story of Sir Gawain, a knight of King Arthur's Round Table, who accepts a challenge from the mysterious Green Knight. Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. This classic novel follows the adventures of an elderly knight who sets out on a quest to revive chivalry and uphold the ideals of knighthood. Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott has to do with a Saxon knight of Richard the Lionheart. So there are many precursors to Roland in literature, and so I kind of feel like King is part of a lineage almost. Now, I don't know if he would think that, but that's kind of how I see it as a reader. Now, both Childe Roland and Roland Deschain experienced feelings of isolation and loneliness during their quests. So they're both kind of solitary figures, and they're depicted as the lone errant knight-errant, in this case a gunslinger. But I think that it's a potent image. You know, you see it in a lot of samurai stories too. The kind of lone warrior. There are a lot of biblical references in this. The Battle of Jericho, the Tower of Babel. The Crimson King is basically like Satan, redemption and sacrifice. Yeah, there are many things. But my final thoughts here, King has created a massive paracosm that rivals Lord of the Rings, if not in some ways surpasses it. I know that's probably sacrilege to say. I mean, I do think that Tolkien, his brilliance was in the invention of languages and everything tied to his world. So his world is very dense, especially with the backstory and back history. But I think King's is also equally dense and interesting. But I have a video on paracosms if you want to check out more about what paracosms are. King's is definitely a detailed paracosm. And I think in the future, people are going to look at it that way. I mean, now King's still alive, so he's written so many books that maybe he's a little bit watered down in some ways, but I think when he's long gone, they're going to see this series as his crowning achievement, and it will surpass every other work that he did. And it changed my life, I'll be honest. It's probably one of my largest literary influences. My first book is highly influenced by this. I was actually finishing it in my thesis in college when I read the last 3 books of this. So they really influenced what I was thinking about at that time. But yeah, I mean, if you haven't read it, I definitely think you should read it. I think everybody should read it. And I want more. If he ends up writing more, I'll gladly take it, even if it's just a short story or whatever. Will we get more? I don't know. But I hope we do. I think there's still some stories to tell in the world, even if it's a tangential character or more prequel stuff. I would definitely take it. But I think that's about all I got. If you benefited from anything in this, or if you know anyone that would benefit, you can share the video. If you want to like and subscribe, I'd appreciate that. I'm trying to get more people seeing my stuff, so that would definitely help me. Anyway, that's about all I got. I will see you next time. Take care.